Welcome everyone to our Wednesday evening Bible study. We're in the midst of the series on the family, and we're looking at how the family is instituted by God, but right now in our society, in our culture, the family is receiving attacks. The idea of divorce, the idea of not meaningful relationships in the marriage relationship, and how difficult that is. We've got children being raised without fathers, so the home is in disarray. The family is under siege by the devil and things that are connected with this world. So we're looking at God's Word and trying to understand this area of the family relationship, which we're going to begin this evening, looking at marriage. We're entitling this lesson, "The Sanctity of Marriage." How do you distinguish between that which is secular and that which is sacred? You'll see a definition that sacred is something that's not secular. Something secular is not sacred. What's the difference? I think we can see that when we think about music. Music in the secular world may be involved with anything, relationships or the things that we do in life and that sort of thing that are secular in its nature, but sacred are things that are pertaining to religion or the things pertaining to God. And so we see that with marriage as well. That marriage, it could be looked upon as a secular institution established by man, or as we see in the Bible, it was an institution established by God. We reverence God in marriage. We look at His will and how He wants marriage to be. And so marriage is sacred. So this evening, we're looking at the sanctity of marriage in our Bible study. We'll look at three main areas where I think the sanctity of marriage is being emphasized. First of all, marriage is sacred because God instituted the relationship and then further established that relationship in future generations. How do we know that from Scripture? First of all, when man was created, this is before women were created, in Genesis 2 and verse 18, God said it was not good for man to be alone. Here was man with all of the animals. He had a job to do of naming the animals. So he had an animal kingdom that he could associate with. He had himself. He had a perfect area in which to live. And yet, he's not the one that said, "I'm lonely. I need somebody." He didn't say that. God said it was not good for man to be alone in verse 18. Secondly, in verse 22, we find that God created the woman, took from the side of man, one of his ribs, and from that formed woman. And he was indeed a complement to the man. But notice it was God that created the helpmeet. It was not man. It was not man that said he's lonely and needed somebody. God saw that, He said that, He created the woman and for the man. Thirdly, God brings the woman to the man in verse 22. It's not that the man finds a woman and thinks, "I'll marry her, I will go with her." God brought the woman to the man, and he replies, "This is now flesh, bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." And then God gives His instruction of how that relationship was going to be furthered. So notice it's not man starting marriage. God did it. He saw it was not good for man to be alone, even when he had the animal kingdom to associate with. He created the woman for the man, and He's the one that brought the woman to the man. And He's the one that first established it. But notice it was established for future generations. How do we know that? When we look at Genesis 2 and verse 24, here's what God says about the matter when He presented the woman to the man. He said, "Therefore," here's the consequence of God's creation, bringing this woman to be His helpmeet for him. "Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." Here's the question. How did that relate to Adam and Eve? Adam did not have a mother and a father. Adam was created from the ground. God breathed in his nostrils the breath of life, and he became a living soul, a living person. And so we see that this law did not pertain to his situation. God instituted it for the first man, but what is saying to us that he established it for future generations as well. A man shall leave his father and his mother. There's going to be a relationship that takes precedence over the father and mother relationship. He's going to cleave to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. So there's the beginning for future generations. So we fast forward. We fast forward to the days of Jesus. Genesis 2:24 is brought up by Jesus himself in Matthew the 19th chapter, verses 4 and 5. He says, have you not read that he who made him from the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? Have you not read that? Where would they read that? In the first book of the law, found in Genesis. Fast forward again. We go to the days of Apostle Paul, as he is now presenting things for churches, as people have become Christians, as Jesus is now not walking upon the earth, but in heaven. And so we see when he talks about marriage, he goes back to the same Genesis 2:24 when he speaks about that relationship. Verse 31, for this cause shall a man leave his father and his mother, and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So it wasn't instituted by God just for the first man, maybe for the first 1,000 years. It was going to be instituted by God for future generations. Father and mother, children grow up, they become a maritable age, and then they leave their father and their mother, and they begin to establish their own families. There's the establishment as creation starts, but then through natural laws, there would indeed be the idea of bringing forth children. And the basis of that would be the marriage relationship. And so man did not start it, and it is indeed for man, but God instituted it. Therefore what? It is sacred. And when we understand that, we realize we're going to be governed by that. And this relationship is closer than the parent-child relationship, and it's one that established the idea of being cleaving to your wife. And reason I know that's the sexual relationship, because Paul in 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 16 says that one can become one flesh with a harlot. There is the sexual relationship being emphasized. And therefore that was what marriage was for, to satisfy those natural desires that are in men and women, and to bring forth children into the world. But there was going to be that close marital relationship between the man and the woman. He made them male and female. We'll talk more about that in a moment. So God instituted it. Now, secondly, the sanctity of marriage demands sexual purity. It is sacred, it is set apart, and this involves the sexual purity. That was to satisfy that fleshly desires, but it was not to be shared with everybody else. And we see in Hebrews the 13th chapter in verse 4, let marriage be had in honor among all. And what is he emphasizing in marriage? We've already established it's probably the sexual relationship, and you're right, because look what happens. Marriage be had in honor among all, and let the bed be undefiled. There's the emphasis upon the sexual relationship. For he says, for fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. So the bed is to be kept undefiled. How does he describe those who violate that relationship? It's fornicators and adulterers. God will judge both of them. Here's a passage where we observe the word fornicators and adulterers in the same verse. When we look at each word individually, fornicators, pornos, is a word that denotes a general reference of any illicit sexual intercourse. Matthew 19 and verse 9, you have married people, and here's one that you're not to be able to put away your mate for any cause, but for the cause of fornication. Why didn't he call it adultery? Because fornication is a general term. It's specifically involved in sexual intercourse, but it's a term that denotes it could be any illicit sexual intercourse. And we'll describe them as the Bible does in a few moments. So that's why it's general. But when we see the word adulterers, it is the unlawful sexual intercourse with the spouse of another. That's why when two people are married and one puts them away, and it's not for the cause of fornication, the man that put her away unjustly will be responsible, for she will be what? A fornicator? No, she'll be an adulteress. She was bound to you, and you put her away, and it wasn't for the cause of fornication. And therefore, because she's bound to you, the next relationship she has will be considered adultery. And therefore, you've had a part in that. She's responsible, but you are as well for putting her away unlawfully. So we see the two words. When they're in the same context, they're probably emphasizing fornication as before, without marriage, and then also as adulterers violating their vows and their marriage bond. But it must be kept pure in all areas. Deeds of sexual immorality and impurity will always begin in the heart. And this is where I think we can learn the importance in our relationships with the opposite sex. It will always begin in the heart. Notice in Mark 7 and verse 21 where Jesus emphasizes this, I think, very plainly for us. Here was what, trying to figure out, is it eating with unwashed hands, is that sort of thing of causing people to be defiled, or was it something more serious? And he says, for from within, out of the heart of men, evil thoughts proceed, fornications, thefts, murders, adulteries, covetings, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, an evil eye, railing, pride, foolishness. Where do they start? Where such things like that start? It starts a lot of times in our thinking, and therefore it starts in the heart that we have to be careful about. And so we need to keep our hearts pure. And people who we have relationships in life, male and female, but it's not sexual in its nature. But we have to be, as men and women, very careful in our interaction with one another, our caring about one another, to not let those emotions go into that sexual desires that can happen real easily if we're not on guard. We're not guarding our heart. Remember in Matthew 5:28, if a man looketh upon a woman to lust after her, he has committed adultery already in his heart. We sometimes apply that to young single men and say, well, how could he commit adultery? Well, maybe it's because he's looking at a woman that's married. Well, what about looking at a girl that's not married? Would he still commit that adultery in his heart? Or could it be also, that needs to apply to men as well. They may be looking at women. They're married to someone else. They may be lusting after them. We've got to guard that heart. We've got to guard our relationships. Because God's instituted it, and it is to be kept pure. It is to be indeed off base for anyone else. A lot of times, people go on their honeymoon in their motel room, they'll put out a do not disturb sign. We need to have that always in our marriage relationship. It's nobody else's business. And that sexual purity must always be there. Guarding our hearts will be helpful. It demands that we abstain. If we're looking at fornication and adultery, think about what it is talking about. It involves premarital sex. Young people, that relationship is saved for marriage. God instituted it. This is the way He designed it. And with a godly attitude, we'll understand that. Fornicators, in that pure sense, is premarital, not dealing with marriage yet. That's a sin. We have to abstain from extramarital sex. We have to keep our heart and guard our eyes. But see, fornication is general enough. It also involves homosexual sex. Notice in Romans, the 1st chapter, and verse 26 and 27, that Paul speaks about this as a being against nature. For this cause God gave them up to vile passions. See, in the heart, we have vile passions. There's a passion that leads to the actions that we're talking about, this sexual intercourse with others. God gave them up to the vile passions, for the women change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men. leaving the natural use of the woman, burn in their lust. Where's that? In the heart. And it led them to satisfy that burning in these illicit relationships. And they burned their lust one toward another, men with men. That word denotes males with males, working unseemless and receiving themselves the recompense of their error which is due. Using their bodies in that particular sexual sin was a violation. A lot of times the sexual sins lead to sickness as well and disease in the body because of those relationships. So God condemns that in the New Testament. And there indeed is broad enough. Well, it's not just heterosexual sex, no, it's homosexual sex. In Leviticus, the 18th chapter, notice he describes the homosexuality there as being something that even that the people in the Old Testament, they were not to be guilty of. God reveals his mind about that, calling it an abomination. In verse 22, thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind, it is an abomination. But he doesn't stop there. And for this lesson, I don't want us to stop there because we see how general the word fornication can be used to apply to illicit sexual intercourse. Thou shalt not lie down with any beast to defile thyself therewith. Neither shall any woman stand before a beast to lie down thereto. It is confusion. It is against nature for men to be with men, women to be with women sexually. It is confusion for men to enter into the animal kingdom and satisfy his lusts that way. And when we say that, bestiality is such a horrible thought and concept, and it is. It's confusion. It's abomination. But isn't it interesting? God addressed both of those together in the Old Testament. I've talked to sheriffs. I've talked to people that are involved in countries, in the countryside and rural areas, where one of the big problems they deal with is bestiality, even in our day. So it's not something that's just off limits because we are so sophisticated today. There's that burning and that lust and the satisfaction of the sexual desires. It can be so perverted that it goes into the animal kingdom, but it is perverted between men and women with women. It's for male and female. And that's what we have to remember that and that relationship. All right? Thirdly, the sanctity of marriage demands that we keep the relationship permanent. In Matthew 19 and verse 6, Jesus makes this point after establishing what was God's will in the beginning. And he says in verse 6, excuse me, so that there are no more two but one flesh. That gets back to that sexual relationship between the male and the female. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. Now what does that mean to let not man put asunder? It simply means to separate. Chorizo, the Greek word, means to separate. It doesn't mean, well, they went off to work at one place in the country and separated from us. No, it's dealing with divorce in the Bible. It's that separation that happens when one divorces. Turn with me to 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 10 and 11, where the Apostle Paul, addressing the brethren in Corinth, addressing things connected with the marriage relationship, he says, but unto the married I give charge unto you, not I, but the Lord, that the wife depart not from her husband. That word depart is our same word that Jesus says separate. And it was done because this is what happens, that when the wife did, she was to remain unmarried. So we're talking about divorce. There's another word that is used in this same context that a man is not to leave his wife. That leaving may be involved in sending her away and then him leaving that relationship. He's not to do that as well. Why? Because God instituted this sexual relationship, enjoins us to be keeping it pure, and thirdly, to keep it permanent. There was not going to be idea of divorce in order to take it away, and he gives one exception. So let's look at something here that I think to illustrate what we see in 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 10 and 11. Because we have a parenthetical statement in verse 11. But should she depart? So should she leave that relationship of marriage? Let her remain unmarried. So she didn't leave for a few weeks. She's unmarried. There's a divorce that's taken place. So she's to remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband is not to leave his wife. I want to illustrate, what do we mean here about, well, she could divorce. You're saying it's permanent? Apparently, a woman could divorce. And therefore, I'm asking, is that all right? Is the divorce sinful? Or we say, well, it's okay if she doesn't remarry. We have people that look at that verse that way. I want to illustrate what I think is happening at this verse by looking at dirty shoes. You walked on a mop floor and you dirtied it all up again. Let's see if that might help us understand some things. Should she depart? Here's someone that has walked across and separated themselves from a clean floor. They've set forth the dirty. They've done something wrong. And we're looking at, if I did that with my wife's floor and brought dirt upon it again, I think that would be wrong. Should she depart? If that takes place, what is she supposed to do? What is she supposed to do? Let her remain unmarried. Has she committed adultery yet? Not until you marry another, according to Matthew 19:9. So here's the state. Let her remain unmarried. So do not marry another, committing another sin, as far as I'm concerned, but committing adultery, which indeed would be a sin. How would that relate to the illustration? If your wife sees you with those dirty feet, she said, stay where you are. Stop where you are. Don't just, I've done wrong, so I might as well just keep on going. No, stop where you are. And then what could be the possibility in this marriage relationship? Or be reconciled to your husband. It didn't say, let her remain unmarried and then be reconciled to her husband. It says or. So what does that mean? Or be reconciled. You stop there, and I'm just going to say what you should be doing, retrace your steps where possible. Don't you take another step forward, remain in that state where you are, but retrace your steps backward where you were and be reconciled to your husband. Nowhere in the Bible do we see reconciliation being done with someone who is innocent being reconciled to someone who is guilty. She's not innocent when she divorced. The word, I think, reconciled indicates that. We don't know exactly why she left, but apparently it wasn't for fornication, because she still need to remain unmarried. Don't commit that action of adultery. But she did wrong. Otherwise, why is she reconciled? Why is she going to be made one again with the man? She was also to be open for that possibility. But what happens if the man doesn't take her back? I think that's implied in this verse as well. She may have hurt that relationship so badly that she will not be able to repair that marriage with him. And then what is she supposed to do? Remain unmarried. Because the next step that she takes and will be fornication. And therefore will be adultery and fornication. And indeed that is a sin. So it's not the idea, well, it's okay to divorce. Is it okay to put mud on the floor and just keep on going because you've already done it? No. You stop. You go back. Retrace your steps. Be reconciled where it's possible. But as far as you were concerned, that's what you would want to be able to do. But you may have to remain unmarried. I think that's what Paul is saying. He's not justifying the divorce just so you remain unmarried. He's not justifying that at all. He just says, if that happens, stop where you are, and then you may have to remain unmarried, but remain unmarried, and if it's possible to reconcile, that's a possibility. Under the old law, you could not go back to your husband once the divorce takes place. In the New Testament, you can. So marriage is sacred because it is to be kept permanent. And we need to understand what it's connected with God. That's what makes it sacred. We know from Malachi, the 2nd chapter, verses 13 through 16, that God hates divorce. One of the things I think is interesting there is that leading up to verse 13, he has condemned the unlawful marriages with foreigners that were leading people into idolatry. He said, this again ye do. And this addresses the divorce of one leaving his wife. The tears are on the altar. He's offering sacrifices unto God and tears because treating a woman treacherously has occurred. And therefore is something that they need to understand with God. Here was a covenant that was made, and God was witness to that, and now they're just throwing it away with all of their divorces that they wanted to do. God hates divorce, not just the unlawful marriages. We need to keep it permanent. God is witness in Malachi 2:14 to the covenant between the man and the woman. Malachi 2:14, he's a witness. When two people make a vow to one another that they will keep themselves from all others, as long as they both shall live, God is a witness to that vow. You're saying it to one another, but you're in the presence of God. So think about the sacredness of marriage. He joins the relationship together. Notice what God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. It didn't say who. Now, I know there's a who there in that relationship, but he said what God had joined together. That relationship is permanent. He is the one that he joins the two together. He joins that relationship called marriage. He's a witness in the covenant, and you think you have the right to put asunder? Today, as we saw in our introductory lesson, we all recognize it as being part of our laws of the land. We have no fault divorces. We just put away any way we want to. And we just said we just can't get along. And the courts of our land will allow those things to happen. But is that right with God? I don't think so. He's the one that sets forth the parameters of it, and he wants it permanent. And what we can say is it's one man, one woman. It is Adam and Eve. It's not Ellen and Helen. It's one man and one woman for life. And it's only one exception that can bring forth a right for one to put away another. And that's for that general term, fornication, which is explicitly setting forth the illicit sexual intercourse between two people. Remember in 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 39, in this same context of divorce and remarriage, is a wife is bound for so long time as her husband liveth. But if the husband be dead, she's free to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord, in connection with the Lord's teachings. And so here a wife is bound. So that's not the wife, it's the idea of bound by law to her husband. How long? As long as you both shall live. And the only time she's free is when he dies. There's one exception, as we saw in Matthew 19 and verse 9. That's for fornication. Paul illustrates this permanency in Romans the 7th chapter and verse 2 and 3. For the woman that hath a husband is bound by law to the husband while he liveth. But if the husband die, she is discharged from the law of the husband. So that if while the husband liveth she be joined to another man, she'll be called an adulteress. But if the husband die, she's free from the law, so that she's no adulteress, though she be joined to another man. She can have another marriage that is not adulterous if death has occurred. But there's one exception, and that is fornication. One man, one woman for life, one exception, fornication. That's the sacred understanding of the marriage relationship. So, in summing up, marriage is sacred. Oh, it involves a lot of secular things, a lot of physical things in life, and we're going to be in the business, how we're going to support our wives and how we're going to support our family. We have to make decisions that are secular, but the marriage relationship itself, which is under attack with divorces and with people not even honoring the marriage, just living with one another, we need to be reminded marriage is sacred because God's involved. He instituted it. He then enjoins us, because he instituted, he enjoins upon us to keep it sexually pure. And what have we stressed? Keep your heart. Married people, and people who are not married yet, keep your heart. because out of it comes fornication and adulteries. Be careful how you interact with the opposite sex. Keep on guard those things, because out of that heart, sometimes out of close associations with sympathy in difficult times, can cause people to be sexually attracted to one another. And we've got to keep it pure. It is off limits to anyone else than our husband and our wife. And thirdly, God enjoins upon us to keep it permanent. One man, one woman for life. And I hope that will help us to keep our marriage intact. Thank you for joining us this evening. May God bless you.